Well, welcome to part two of Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling, much of which takes place around the story of the Akeda, or the ritual binding of Isaac. So we need to look at the story of Isaac just a little bit. A little bit of background before we can get into the section of Fear and Trembling called the Attunement. About 1800 BC, there is a city called which is a pagan city, a pagan culture. And within it, there lived a man called Terra, who was an idol builder. It was his job to construct the idols that the pagans would take and place in their homes and their businesses and their gardens and so on, to bring various blessings to the family and to the business. Well, Terah had a son called Abram. And one day, when Abram is about 14 years old, he is left alone to mind the idol shop. And his father goes away for a few days on business. When the father comes back, he finds that every single one of the idols in that shop, except for the one largest one, has been smashed and destroyed. Now, of course, he's very upset by this because, after all, he's put a lot of time and effort and energy into it. This is where the family makes their money and their business, and he demands to know what's happened. And Abram says to him, well, this one giant deity here became angry and destroyed all of the others. Terah did not buy that for a minute. He knew that either Abram smashed those other idols or he let somebody else do it. He never thought for one moment that it was that one largest deity that was responsible for this. And that proved the point that Abram was trying to make, which is that he knows that these pagan deities are nothing more than clay that he's fashioned himself, that there's no reality or substance to them. If he really believed in the legends that he sold, then why couldn't the one have become angry and destroyed the others? Never once did he contemplate that idea. And so Abram was well on his way towards removing himself from the pagan world and beginning to embrace this new deity, this being in the sky, who becomes the god of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, Abram is given a wife, Sarai, and they make a covenant with God. And when you make a covenant, you take on a new name. So Abram becomes Abraham, Sarai becomes Sarah or Sarah. And God promises that a child is going to be born to them. But they wait and wait and wait and wait some more, and still no child comes. Well, Sarah begins to wonder if perhaps this prophecy was not just directed at Abraham, not towards the couple. And so she allows Abraham to lie with her handmaiden, Hagar. And sure enough, together Abraham and Hagar produce a child, which they call Ishmael. Ishmael is going to be loved, he's going to be doted upon, he is the child that has been desired, that has been wanted. And of course, we know that his lineage will eventually lead on to Muhammad and the founding of Islam. But Sarah doesn't really like this, because the more that Abraham dotes upon Ishmael, he also dotes upon Hagar as the mother. But there's not a lot she can do about it. But then we're told of this tremendous miracle that takes place. When Sarah is 90 years old and Abraham is 99, a child is born to them. And this is Isaac. Sarah seizes upon this opportunity. This is the real child. This is the son that God promised us. This is the one who is destined to become great. Ishmael is a bastard. And so Ishmael should be cast out into the wilderness. Abraham, of course, didn't want to do this. He loved Ishmael very much. He perceived him as being that blessed child. But Sarah kept prompting and pushing, and eventually he relents. And Hagar and Ishmael are both cast out, and their story becomes an important part of the Quran. But in terms of the book of Genesis, the focus is upon Isaac. Isaac is that promised one who will go on to become the leader, the founder of a great nation. And so Isaac is raised within this tradition. But then we come to Genesis 22, the story of the Akedah. And I wanted to just read this to you for anyone who is not familiar with it. Sometime afterward, God put Abraham to the test. He said to him, "Abraham," and he answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Take your son, your favored one Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the heights that I will point out to you." So early next morning, Abraham saddled his ass and took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. He split the wood for the burnt offering, and he set off for the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his servants, "You stay here with the ass. The boy and I will go up there, we will worship, and we will return to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and put it on his son Isaac. He himself took the firestone and the knife, and the 2 walked off together. Then Isaac said to his father Abraham, "Father," and he answered, "Yes, my son." And he said, "Here are the firestone and the wood, but where's the sheep for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will see to the sheep for his burnt offering, my son." And the 2 of them walked on together. They arrived at the place of which God had told him. Abraham built an altar there. He laid out the wood. He bound his son Isaac. He laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to slay his son. Then an angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham." And he answered, "Here I am." And he said, "Do not raise your hand against that boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your favored one, from me." When Abraham looked up, his eye fell upon a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went, and he took the ram, and he offered it up as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that site Adonai Yireh, whence the present saying, "On the mount of the Lord there is a vision." Now, in this story of the Akedah, we have a situation where here is this child that Abraham has been waiting for his entire life. He's 99 years old by the time that Isaac is born. And some people, of course, question that. How is it possible that a 99-year-old man, a 90-year-old woman can give birth? And, well, there's various responses to that. One of those, obviously, is the fact that when we look at the Bible, people tended to live longer lives than what we do now in the earlier periods. Adam, for example, lives to be 650 something. Abraham himself lives to be 175. So maybe there is something, within it to do with that. It could be, some people have argued that, well, it has to do with the difference of seasons. And so they didn't count years in the same way that we did. And so maybe it's, seasons rather than years, which would maybe cut that in half to where maybe she's 45 when she gives birth. Very difficult, but not impossible. But that's today. That's with medical science, 45. At this time period, that would have most likely killed both to try to produce a child at that age. The point of all of it is that it's a miracle, and it's meant to be taken as a miracle. It is there only as a gift of God and nothing else. Now, Abraham has the opportunity to raise Isaac, to become devoted to him, and then all of a sudden, God says, give him back. Take him to this mountaintop, offer him there for sacrifice, take this gift that I've given you, and give it back to me. And that seems like the most horrific thing that a deity could possibly do. But yet, when individuals read this story, or they hear about it in Sunday school or preached about in a sermon, they just accept it. They just take it for granted. And one of the key points that Abraham wants to get across is that this is not something that we should just accept because it's written down in Scripture. We need to really put ourselves in this position and try to understand what it is that Abraham is going through. Now, I would point out that there is a little bit of disagreement with regards to Isaac himself. Um, Kierkegaard is, of course, looking at this from the classical Christian perspective of the story, which means that Isaac is perceived as a small child, maybe 9 or 10 years old, when this event takes place. But scriptural analysis, along with the Jewish tradition, and even many of the early church fathers, put Isaac's age considerably older. The most logical stems from the Jewish tradition, which simply points out that since Isaac's mother, Sarah, is 90 years old when he's born, and the very next thing that's recorded after this event is the death of Sarah at 127, that would make Isaac 37 years old when this event takes place. Now that, I think, is considerably important, because it means that if Isaac is a small child, he may not have any real inkling of what's going on. The simple answer that he was given in this story, that, oh, God will provide for the burnt offering, is something that Abraham could give to the child, and he would just gladly accept it and not think twice about it. But from the more traditional Jewish perspective of the older Isaac, this is somebody who is rational, somebody who is intelligent, somebody who's not going to be fooled by those easy answers. This is an individual that really is going to have a say in whether or not he wants to go through with this or not. And so many times it's perceived as an example of Kaddish Hashem. Kaddish Hashem is the sanctification of the divine name, a willingness to martyr yourself, a willingness to die because it is the will of God. And it seems that Isaac is the one who is really being tested in all of this. Is he willing to lay down his life? Is he willing to die? Because God wills it. Now, obviously, when tests like this are put forward, it seems fairly obvious that God already knows the answer. In choosing Isaac in the first place, he knows that he is someone who is destined for greatness. He knows that he will be the founder of this nation. But Isaac doesn't know it himself. He has to be tested. And that is, in essence, what this story really is about. But again, Kierkegaard rather, is not really going to be looking at it from that particular standpoint. He's not really going to be looking at it from that perspective. He's going to see the more traditional view, and so he sees, Abraham as being the one who is being tested by God. He sees Abraham as being the one who is making these choices and these decisions. Now, why would somebody like Abraham, why would he do this? Why would he take this child that he loves so much and dotes upon so much and offering him up for sacrifice simply because God has asked him to do so? We don't know. But Kierkegaard says it would be great to find out. Again, in that existentialist sense, all that a person can do is kind of look back in hindsight. And we know that ultimately the only person who knows why Abraham made the decision that he made is Abraham himself. But what Kierkegaard wants to do is to be on that mountaintop. He wants to be watching this event as it transpires. He wants us to perceive these events as they take place. In the opening of the attunement, it says, his soul had but one wish, actually to see Abraham, and one longing to have been witness to those events. What he yearned for was to accompany them on the 3-day journey, when Abraham rode with grief before him, and Isaac by his side. And so in this attunement section, he says, yes, we have simply taken what is written down and maybe we don't think about how awful this situation is for the simple reason that we just accept it because it seems like it turns out well, right? We know in hindsight that Isaac is spared. We know in hindsight that the ram is sacrificed in his stead. We know that Isaac goes on to become the founder of the great nation and so on. We know that it all works out well according to God's plan. But if you were to put yourself back in that perspective, back at that time, you wouldn't realize this. You wouldn't know this. You would have to be, as Abraham must have been, thrust into an impossible situation and forced to make a decision in that moment. And so the way it's recorded in Genesis may be the way it was played out, but it's not the only way that it could play out. And so in this attunement section, Kierkegaard is going to reveal to us 4 other possibilities, 4 other ways that it might ultimately have been able to play out also. There we go. And so here is the first. It was early morning. Abraham rose in good time, but the asses saddled and left his tent, taking Isaac with him. But Sarah watched them from the window as they went down the valley, until she could see them no more. They rode in silence for 3 days, and on the morning of the 4th, Abraham still said not a word, but he raised his eyes and saw afar the mountain in Moriah. He left the lads behind and went on alone up the mountain with Isaac beside him. But Abraham said to himself, I won't conceal from Isaac where this way is leading him. He stood still. He laid his hand on Isaac's head to give him his blessing, and Isaac bent down to receive it. And Abraham's expression was fatherly, his gaze gentle, his speech encouraging. But Isaac could not understand him. His soul could not be uplifted. He clung to Abraham's knees. He pleaded at his feet. He begged for his young life, for his fair promise. He called to mind the joy in Abraham's house, reminded him of the sorrow and the loneliness. Then Abraham lifted the boy up and walked with him, taking him by the hand, and his words were full of comfort and exhortation. But Isaac could not understand him. Abraham climbed the mountain in Moriah, but Isaac did not understand him. Then he turned away from Isaac for a moment, but when Isaac saw his face a second time, he was changed. His gaze was wild, his mien one of horror. He caught Isaac by the chest, he threw him to the ground and said, Foolish boy, do you believe I am your father? I am an idolater. Do you believe this is God's command? No, it's my own desire. Then Isaac trembled in an anguish, and he cried, God in heaven, have mercy upon me. God of Abraham, have mercy upon me. If I have no father on earth, then be thou my father. But below his breath, Abraham said to himself, Lord in heaven, I thank thee. It is after all better that he believe I am a monster than that he lose faith in thee. So in this first scenario, Abraham comes forward and he's very open, he's very honest with Isaac. He explains to Isaac what he is going to do, that it is the will of God that Isaac be sacrificed. But Isaac doesn't handle the news very well, and so he begs and he pleads, as we would imagine a small child doing. But Abraham is not going to relent. Now, Abraham could have told Isaac that this was truly God's will, that it had been commanded, that God wanted his death, that a voice spoke to him and told him these things. Isaac would know that Abraham couldn't refuse. But if that were the case, Isaac might lose his faith in God. How could God command his death? How could God demand the loss of the happiness and the joy that belonged to him and his father? But rather than that, Abraham keeps his knowledge from Isaac, and he makes himself out to be the monster. He wants to make sure that Isaac holds faith in God, even if he has to lose faith in his father. Abraham, when he shows himself to Isaac in this scenario, is not a man of God. He's a lunatic. He's a maniac that wants to kill his son and is not going to be dissuaded by it. He feels better if Isaac despises him rather than if he loses faith in God himself. And so all of these scenarios have an element of what we might call Socratic irony in it. And this one, as you see on the screen here, is basically the idea that perhaps the person that shows his godliness is not really one that's godly. And he who rejects his godliness is actually the most godly. You know, that individual who is perhaps putting on their finest attire, making sure that everybody sees them when they go into church, they are maybe not all that godly of an individual, because what they're there for is to show off and get acclaim for themselves. Whereas the person that perhaps walks in largely unnoticed in a t-shirt and scruffy jeans and sits in the back, you know, that person might be much more holy because they are there, you know, to take in the atmosphere, to hear the sermon, to offer their prayers. But it's not about them, it's about God. And so sometimes showing your godliness is not what makes you godly. And so Abraham, in making himself out to be the monster, ends up actually being a much more holy person perhaps than he was, because he would have ensured that Isaac had kept his faith. Let's look at the second scenario. It was early morning. Abraham rose in good time, embraced Sarah, the bride of his old age, and Sarah kissed Isaac, who had taken her disgrace from him. Was her pride and hope for all generations. So they rode on in silence, and Abraham's eyes were fixed on the ground until the fourth day, when he looked up and saw afar the mountain in Moriah. But he turned his gaze once again towards the ground. Silently he arranged the firewood, bound Isaac. Silently he drew the knife. Then he saw the ram that God had appointed. He sacrificed that and returned home. From that day on, Abraham became old. He could not forget that God had demanded this of him. Isaac throve as before, but Abraham's eyes were darkened. He saw joy no more. So in this second scenario, Abraham is going to kind of go through the motions of obedience. And he's in almost a state of dumbfoundedness. You know, God demands the unthinkable of him, but it is God, and because of that, Abraham must comply. But Abraham is in shock. He's in horror at the command that he's given. Well, then God presents the ram, which Abraham sacrifices in Isaac's stead. But Abraham can't just forgive and forget. He can't let go of what God has made him go through, this anguish, this terror that he had to wrestle with. And so there's always going to be disgust towards God for what was demanded. And because of this disgust and this animosity towards God, Abraham no longer finds joy within his life. Joy was conferred upon him by his son, by a son that God gave him. Joy was conferred by God. But when God threatened to take away that joy, and then failed to do so, Abraham loses everything. And so the element of irony within this one is that Abraham is going to lose his joy by maintaining his joy. By being able to keep the thing that he loves the most, it ultimately loses the joy that brought because of his loss of love and his loss of faith in a God that would make him endure such a horrible decision. Third scenario. It was early morning. Abraham rose in good time, kissed Sarah, the young mother, and Sarah kissed Isaac, her delight, her joy forever. And Abraham rode thoughtfully on. He thought of Hagar and the son whom he had driven out into the desert. He climbed the mountain in Moriah. He drew the knife. It was a tranquil evening when Abraham rode out alone. And he rode to the mountain in Moriah. He threw himself on his face. He begged God to forgive his sin at having been willing to sacrifice Isaac, at the father's having forgotten his duty to his son. He rode more frequently on his lonely way. He found no peace. He could not comprehend that it was a sin to have been willing to sacrifice to God the best that he owned, that for which he would many times have gladly laid down his own life. And if it was a sin, if he had not so loved Isaac, then he could not understand that it could be forgiven. For what sin was more terrible? In this one, we find Abraham is going to take a stand against God. Isaac is his promised son, and God is demanding that he be sacrificed, demanding him back. But Abraham couldn't bring himself to do this. He couldn't offer him as a sacrifice. And so Abraham chooses to go to Mount Moriah by himself. He begs God for his forgiveness. He has the sin of disobeying God upon his shoulders. But he fails to realize that that failing to obey God is a sin, but willing to kill Isaac is also a sin. And this scenario actually points out one of the central faults or central problems with placing the emphasis upon Abraham. And we see this through the element of irony here. To obey is to disobey. To disobey is to obey. So if this is actually a test of Abraham, then it's a Kobayashi Maru test. It's a test where there is no right answer. Because on the one hand, God has commanded that he take Isaac and sacrifice Isaac. But on the other hand, God has forbidden human sacrifice. So if he obeys God in sacrificing Isaac, he is at the same time disobeying God, who will not allow human sacrifice. If he chooses to not sacrifice Isaac because of the human sacrifice being forbidden, then he is disobeying God at the same time by not sacrificing Isaac. Because there is this contradiction with what's being said, there is no way for Abraham to really come out on top. There's no way for Abraham to really win in this particular scenario. So this is why, again, I think it's difficult to place this as a test of Abraham. It's really more of a test of Isaac. But again, this is the scenario that Kierkegaard gives us. The final scenario. It was early morning. Everything had been made ready for the journey in Abraham's house. Abraham took leave of Sarah, and the faithful servant Eliezer followed him out on his way until he had to turn back. They rode together in accord, Abraham and Isaac, until they came to the mountain in Moriah. Yet Abraham made everything ready for the sacrifice, calmly and quietly. But as he turned away, Isaac saw that Abraham's left hand was clenched in anguish, that a shudder went through his body. But Abraham drew the knife. Then they turned home again, and Sarah ran to meet them. But Isaac had lost his faith. Never a word in the whole world is spoken of this, and Isaac told no one what he had seen, and Abraham never suspected that anyone had seen it. So in this last scenario, Abraham takes Isaac to Mount Moriah. He begins the sacrifice. He's stopped by the voice. He's stopped by the ram. So Abraham is choosing, as in the traditional biblical story, to go through with the sacrifice. But in seeing what it is that God and his father were willing to do, Isaac ends up losing his faith, which means this is kind of the opposite of the first scenario. So in this instance, we could say that Abraham passes the test, but Isaac fails. Together, the father and the son are going to conceal what transpired on the mountaintop, and no one's really going to notice. What this fourth scenario then becomes is a story of growth. It's a movement from one reality or one acceptance to another. And it shows the ultimate flux of existence, the fluidity of the universe. Sometimes it's necessary to give up something comfortable in exchange for something frightening. And that transference is part of the growth. Now, this story is important within Kierkegaard's writing, more so than the other three, because it's going to pave the way for this concept that he calls the leap of faith. And so this Socratic irony that we find here is that one must lose their faith in order to take the leap of faith. We have to be willing to give up our objectivity in exchange for subjectivity. Think back to Plato and his allegory of the cave. A lot of people, upon seeing the outside world, simply wanted to go back inside the cave, back to what was comfortable, back to what they knew. Only a rare few were willing to go through what was necessary to be able to come out into the outside world and really come to know it, really come to experience it. Because no matter what that life is, we tend to prefer what we know to what is the unknown. In order to jump to that unknown, that takes a leap of faith. And that's the thing that we need to understand from this last scenario, is that sometimes we do have to give up what is comfortable in exchange for something that is frightening. Just as a person that has always lived in a particular area, all their friends, all their associations are there, and now all of a sudden they're given this tremendously wonderful opportunity to advance their career, make a lot more money, but they have to move to the other side of the world to do it. Some people will make that chance, but the vast majority would be too afraid to do so. But to potentially end up with something greater, something more, you have to let go of what you know. You have to let go of what's comfortable and take that leap of faith. Now, these 4 versions of the Akeda are really intended to prepare the reader for what is to come. And that is very simply the idea that within this story, within any biblical story, within any history, within any story whatsoever, don't just read it, think about it. As a reader, immerse yourself in the story, participate in the process. Don't just accept the easy answers as they're given to you, but become part of the decision. And when you do, you recognize that there are no easy answers. Abraham, like we said, was thrust into a terrible situation, one that nobody would ever want to be placed into. We don't know what went on in his mind, but we would like to know. We can put ourselves perhaps, or try to put ourselves in his position, but it will still not be exactly the same because we're not Abraham. We're not him. Far too often people will take something like this and, the story of the Akeda or any Bible verse, and they'll memorize it, they'll recite it back. But that doesn't mean they've actually thought about it. Doesn't mean they actually understand the human dimension of what's going on there. So immerse yourself in the story and become part of the process. Get as close to that character as you can so that you can feel the anguish that they are going through. Kierkegaard, as I said, embraces the idea of subjectivity. So there is no one singular way to read this story. As an existing being, Abraham could have made any or all of the decisions that we talked about here. There are many others that haven't been mentioned that he could have made. There's a lot of ways this story could have played out, other than the way it was recorded in Genesis. So who is it that can ultimately understand Abraham? There's only one person, and that's Abraham himself. And that's why Kierkegaard has this desire to see him, to be on the mountaintop, to witness the events as they transpire. The individual creates only in the moment through the exercise of their own free will. So in order to know, one must be. In order to truly know what Abraham chose and why he chose it, we would have to be Abraham. And we can't do that. We can try to get close to it. We can try to put ourselves in his perspective. We can try to question, what would we do under those circumstances? But we are not Abraham. We're 4,000 years on from Abraham. We're a completely different culture from Abraham. We're a completely different person from Abraham. So putting myself into that perspective will help me to realize that every situation is unique and different. And we have to face every particular moment of its own accord. We need to take that freedom that we possess, that ultimate sense of free will, and make these choices, make these decisions to the best of our ability. And we understand, or hopefully will understand, what it is that we would do in that situation. And while that is not Abraham, it will get us close to Abraham. It will help us to understand the reality, the human choice, the particular nature of what it is that he endured. And this is where we're going to have to leave it for this video. We'll pick up in the next one with the speech in praise of Abraham.